Underwater combat and travel in the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons is seldom a topic of importance at most tables. However, when it does come up, it's not uncommon to be a little confused as to how it works exactly. So, how is fighting underwater different to normal combat, and what sort of things should you keep in mind when traversing the murky depths? Quickish answer, you move with your swim speed or half your walk speed, and both are affected by difficult terrain. Travel pace works normally if you have a swim speed, or you make the con save every hour if you don't, or every minute if you're in frigid water and are not acclimated, resistant, or immune to cold. Deep waters multiply the rate at which you make the saves, doubled below 100 feet, quadrupled below 200, but spending 30 days at certain depths overcomes this. An athletics check is needed for rough waters, and you can only see 60, 30, or 10 feet based on light level and clarity. Melee weapon attacks with certain weapons have disadvantage unless you have a swim speed, and ranged attacks with most weapons always have disadvantage and auto miss at long range. Everything is resistant to fire underwater, and you suffocate if you cannot breathe water. Spellcasting is technically unaffected by water. That's a lot of information, so feel free to come back and have a look at the elaboration on the screen if you ever need a reference. Now, let's go over where it all comes from and how it all interacts. We'll start with the rules for suffocating on page 183 of the Player's Handbook, which are the simplest rules we have to cover and will apply if you don't have a means of breathing water. Suffocating. A creature can hold its breath for a number of minutes equal to 1 plus its constitution modifier, minimum of 30 seconds. When a creature runs out of breath or is choking, it can survive for a number of rounds equal to its constitution modifier, minimum of 1 round. At the start of its next turn, it drops to 0 hit points and is dying, and it can't regain hit points or be stabilized until it can breathe again. That's all very self-explanatory, but something to note is that most abilities that let you breathe water, like the aptly named spell, Water Breathing, do not have built-in safeguards against whatever else may be in the water you will be breathing. So that means whatever toxins or contaminants a character breathes in while underwater are going straight into their systems. Another thing to note is that you do make death saving throws as normal while suffocating at 0 hit points. However, since you cannot stabilize, reaching 3 successful saves means nothing, so you keep rolling until you get 3 failures or someone saves you. As for actually moving around while underwater, that's all covered in special types of movement on page 182 of the Player's Handbook. But most people forget that moving through difficult terrain while underwater without a swim speed doesn't half your movement again, it only brings it down to a third. It's actually the same for being prone, which is something to remember because that condition comes up a lot more than swimming does. So, we know how fast we can move and how long we can hold our breath, but what about long distance travel while underwater? That gets elaborated on in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 116, Unusual Environments. Underwater, swimming. Unless aided by magic, a character can't swim for a full 8 hours per day. After each hour of swimming, a character must succeed on a DC 10 Constitution saving throw or gain 1 level of exhaustion. A creature that has a swimming speed, including a character with a ring of swimming, or similar magic, can swim all day without penalty and uses the normal forced march rules in the Player's Handbook. Swimming through deep water is similar to traveling at high altitudes, because of the water's pressure and cold temperature. For a creature without a swimming speed, each hour spent swimming at a depth greater than 100 feet counts as 2 hours for the purpose of determining exhaustion. Swimming for an hour at a depth greater than 200 feet counts as 4 hours. Underwater visibility. Visibility underwater depends on water clarity and the available light. Unless the characters have light sources, use the underwater encounter distance table to determine the distance at which characters underwater become aware of a possible encounter. Then we have the actual table for underwater encounter distance, and there's a bit of a typo at the beginning where it says creature size, but instead it details the water conditions, so we'll just consider that column to read as water conditions instead. And then it shows us in the encounter distance table, it says that we can see encounters from 60, 30, or 10 feet away, based on whether the water is clear or well lit. Focusing on underwater visibility first, it's all pretty easy to understand, although a DM may want to decide on the fly how much visibility you have in any given scenario, or how this interacts with dark vision, which grants no benefit underwater normally. It also doesn't specify how light helps you see exactly, so it might imply that you can see within the light's radius, or that the type of light can help influence which of these figures you use. Everything else here tells us that essentially, a creature with a swim speed travels with the normal rules for such on page 181 of the Player's Handbook, but a creature without one has to make their Constitution saving throw every hour from the get-go, instead of after 8 hours. But how far can they get in this time? The normal forced march travel distances should apply for most groups, but for groups with faster average swim speeds, the rules for special travel pace on page 242 of the Dungeon Master's Guide provide ways to calculate travel speed for any given party, and these can be used to figure out the travel speed of swimming creatures. Further, these rules tell us that the rate at which a character without a swim speed makes those saving throws against exhaustion is affected by how deep they're swimming, effectively doubling below 100 feet and quadrupling below 200 feet. Some quick math tells us that they will be making saves every half hour or every 15 minutes respectively. A particular scary thought is how this interacts with the rules for frigid water on page 110 of the Dungeon Master's Guide under Wilderness Survival. Frigid water. A creature can be immersed in frigid water for a number of minutes equal to its constitution score before suffering any ill effects. Each additional minute spent in frigid water requires the creature to succeed on a DC 10 Constitution saving throw or gain 1 level of exhaustion. Creatures with resistance or immunity to cold damage automatically succeed on the saving throw, as do creatures that are naturally adapted to living in ice-cold water. So if we take these rules in tandem with the rules for unusual environments, this means the Constitution score minutes a character has before they start freezing to death could be halved or even quartered if they found themselves thrust even a few hundred feet into frigid depths. And then it would only be increments of 30 or 15 seconds, roughly 5 or 3 turns respectively, before they have to start making their saves against exhaustion. In such a case, a player will want to hope that they're one of the few lucky races who come acclimated to deep waters like the Tritons, or acclimated to cold climates like the Goliath. A common theme with these rule sets is that having a swim speed overcomes most of the detriments of traversing underwater areas, which I understand is done to simplify the process and make it overall more fun for players. But I as the DM prefer to put more of a focus on the survival elements of the game, so I tend to change a few things up to better reflect that, like making the time multiplication of depth affect any creature not native to underwater areas, swim speed or no. I also rule that having only resistance to cold only grants advantage on the con save for frigid depths, instead of auto-succeeding. Immunity or acclimation are unchanged. The last things we can take from the rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide is that the rules for high altitudes, also under Wilderness Survival, are called out as being used for deep depths underwater in unusual environments. So that means a character can take the time, specifically 30 days, to become acclimated to deep depths. But this is only effective to certain altitudes for non-native creatures in the rules for high altitudes. So what extent this translates to underwater depths exactly is left to the discretion of the DM. With all that exhibition aside, we finally come to the most common reason a character will find themselves underwater. Underwater combat on page 198 of the Player's Handbook. Underwater combat. When making a melee weapon attack, a creature that doesn't have a swimming speed, either natural or granted by magic, has disadvantage on the attack roll unless the weapon is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident. A ranged weapon attack automatically misses a target beyond the weapon's normal range. Even against a target within normal range, the attack roll has disadvantage unless the weapon is a crossbow, a net, or a weapon that is thrown like a javelin, including a spear, trident, or dart. Creatures and objects that are fully immersed in water have resistance to fire damage. As with all of our rules thus far, that's pretty self-contained for the most part. But by reading into it, there are a couple things that we can note. Firstly, some players mistake the benefits of the sharpshooter feat as eliminating your long range value. But what it actually does is just remove the disadvantage attacking at that range normally gives you. So Sharpshooter will not allow you to attack at long range underwater. Second, being underwater seems to have no effect on ranged or melee spell attacks, but your DM might have a different call, so ask them about it first. Now, onto the topic of spellcasting. Being underwater technically has no impact on a creature's spellcasting rules as written, beyond that fire spells are half as effective. However, a common house rule DMs will employ is that casting spells with verbal components has an effect on how long you can hold your breath for. This is a fair house rule in my opinion, as the rules for verbal components state that you must be able to speak clearly in order to perform them, though some DMs also rule that being able to breathe water also allows you to perform verbal components unimpeded. So, as with all things, ask your DM ahead of time to be sure. So that's all the rules we have in regards to moving and fighting underwater. But I'm interested to know what house rules you or your DMs use, or perhaps you know of a rule that I missed. I'll pin any good comments and we can continue to discuss it. Beyond that, consider subscribing if you want to stick around for more D&D rules videos like this. Thank you for watching, have a great day, and may the dice be ever in your favour.